Summer, 1940. Europe is in flames. Hitler's armies have crushed Poland in weeks, stormed into Denmark and Norway, and rolled across France with terrifying speed. In less than a year, the Nazi war machine has brought almost the entire continent to its knees. Now, in the center of this empire, lies a tiny republic, Switzerland, a country of mountains, valleys, and villages that suddenly finds itself encircled by the Axis powers. To the north, the Reich. To the south, Mussolini's Italy. To the west, defeated France. To the east, Austria already swallowed by Hitler. On the map, Switzerland looks doomed, an island of neutrality surrounded by oceans of conquest. And yet, against all odds, the invasion never came. The swastika never flew over Bern, Zurich, or Geneva. Instead, Switzerland remained free, armed, watchful, and waiting. Every nation in Hitler's path fell, but not this one. Why? It wasn't luck. Switzerland survived because it turned itself into a fortress, a banker, and a spy's paradise all at once. But that's only the beginning. The truth lies in the cold calculations of war, in mountains too deadly to cross, in banks too useful to burn, and in a dictator who realized that conquering Switzerland might cost more than leaving it alone. This is the untold story of the country Hitler feared to invade.
Is narrow, and weather unpredictable. Any invading army would have to funnel itself into tiny corridors, where defenders could strike from above with machine guns and artillery hidden in the rock. This strategy was formalized in what became known as the National Redoubt. The idea was simple, but brilliant. If invaded, the Swiss army would not fight for the cities or lowland plains. They would retreat into the Alps, carrying with them supplies, destroying every road and bridge behind them, and locking themselves into fortified strongholds deep in the mountains. There, they would deny the enemy access to Switzerland's core and bleed them dry in a long, grinding war of attrition. It was a plan designed not to win outright, but to make the price of conquest unbearable. Neutrality and preparedness went hand in hand. Switzerland never claimed it could defeat Germany in open battle. But it promised something else. That if Hitler ordered an invasion, he would inherit not a functioning state but a burning ruin, a land where every tunnel was collapsed, every valley mined, every soldier ready to die on home soil. At the same time, Switzerland's role in Europe was not just military, but economic. By the late 1930s, it had become a crossroads of trade and finance. Its banks were legendary for their secrecy, a magnet for gold, currency, and investments from across the continent. For the Nazi regime, desperate to fund its war machine, Switzerland was not an enemy but a lifeline. Stolen gold, looted from Jewish families, occupied central banks, and the vaults of conquered nations, often passed through Swiss accounts. Precision instruments, clocks, watches, optics, were manufactured in Swiss factories and quietly sold across borders. Even as war erupted, the neutral Swiss economy remained entangled with that of the Reich. But neutrality was a dangerous balancing act. On one side, the Allies pressured Switzerland not to become too friendly with Hitler. On the other, Germany loomed as a constant threat, ready to punish any betrayal with invasion. Switzerland walked a fine line, trying to maintain its independence while dealing with a dictator who respected only strength. And strength was what the Swiss projected. In the late 1930s, as Hitler rearmed and prepared for war, Switzerland doubled down on its defenses. Mountains were tunneled out to create hidden bunkers. Artillery batteries were concealed in cliffsides, disguised as barns or rocks. Bridges were pre-wired with explosives. Anti-aircraft guns dotted the skylines of major cities. The message was clear: neutrality was not an invitation to invade. Neutrality would be enforced with fire and steel. This combination of military preparation, geographic advantage, and economic entanglement made Switzerland unique in Hitler's Europe. Unlike Belgium, which relied on treaties and collapsed under German assault, Switzerland intended to fight for every inch. Unlike Czechoslovakia, betrayed by its allies, Switzerland had no illusions of foreign rescue. Its survival would depend on its own determination, and the perception it could instill in Berlin that conquering it was not worth the cost. And perception mattered. Nazi Germany was a predator that chose its prey carefully. Poland, France, the Low Countries, each was attacked because they offered quick victories, strategic depth, and resources to fuel Hitler's ambitions. Switzerland offered none of these. What it offered was delay, attrition, and resistance. Even before the first German troops set foot on Swiss soil, Hitler and his generals would have to reckon with the price they would pay. Still, fear and preparation alone could not explain everything. Switzerland was not invincible, and Hitler had proven time and again that he was willing to gamble lives for conquest. There had to be more. Deeper calculations, hidden motives, and cold realities that shaped Hitler's decision. Switzerland was not merely spared by its mountains or militias. It was spared because, in Hitler's eyes, it was more valuable alive than dead. To understand why, we must look not only at Switzerland's defenses, but at Hitler's war plans, his economic needs, and the role this small neutral state played in the wider game of global war. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Switzerland was not at the forefront of his ambitions. His vision was grander, rooted in the ideology of Lebensraum, the creation of a vast empire in Eastern Europe where the German people would expand, conquer, and settle. In Hitler's worldview, the destiny of the Reich lay not in the Alps but in the fertile plains of Poland, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and the breadbasket of Ukraine. Yet as Europe spiraled into war, every small state in his path became a question of strategy. Switzerland was no exception. By 1939, the Third Reich had transformed itself into a juggernaut. Blitzkrieg had ripped Poland apart in just over 4 weeks. Denmark and Norway had fallen in a matter of days. In May and June 1940, Hitler's armies rolled across Belgium, the Netherlands, and France with breathtaking speed. To the casual observer, conquest seemed inevitable wherever his armies struck. To Switzerland, surrounded on all sides by this tidal wave of aggression, survival appeared almost impossible. And yet, Hitler hesitated. Why? The foundation of German military planning in the Second World War was Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The idea was simple: concentrate overwhelming firepower, break through the enemy front with tanks and motorized infantry, encircle armies, and force surrender before the opponent could react. It was a doctrine designed for speed, shock, and mobility. But Blitzkrieg depended on terrain. It thrived on the flat plains of Poland and the open countryside of France. Switzerland, by contrast, was the antithesis of everything Blitzkrieg required. Its heart was a labyrinth of granite peaks, narrow valleys, and twisting passes. Tanks would be bottlenecked into predictable routes, vulnerable to artillery hidden in cliff sides. Trucks and supply columns would crawl up steep gradients, exposed to ambush from above. Aircraft, so essential to the German war machine, would struggle to coordinate bombing runs in such volatile mountain weather. German generals understood this. War games conducted in Berlin, and later in Munich, repeatedly showed that an invasion of Switzerland would not be a matter of days or weeks, but months. Losses would be high, and even if the Germans succeeded, they would inherit not a functioning economy but a smoking ruin. The Swiss had already wired their infrastructure with explosives. Every major bridge, tunnel, and railway line could be destroyed at a moment's notice. The Wehrmacht would gain little more than inaccessible terrain and a population prepared to resist guerrilla style. Still, invasion was not off the table. In the summer of 1940, with France defeated, Germany drafted plans for a potential strike against Switzerland. The operation was codenamed Operation Tannenbaum, the German word for Christmas tree. According to surviving records, it envisioned a joint assault by Germany and Italy involving as many as 11 divisions, roughly 300,000 troops. The objective would be swift: seize Zurich, Geneva, and Bern, crush the Swiss army, and occupy key Alpine passes to secure routes between Germany and Italy. Italian divisions would attack from the south through Ticino, while German forces would descend from the north and east. The plan was detailed enough to include troop movements, timetables, and supply lines. But even in its conception, Operation Tannenbaum revealed deep anxieties. German intelligence reported that Switzerland could mobilize nearly 500,000 soldiers, not enough to defeat Germany outright, but more than enough to slow down its advance. Analysts warned that every valley would become a killing ground, every road mined, every retreat a trap. Capturing Switzerland would require tying down hundreds of thousands of troops in garrison duty, precisely when Hitler needed those divisions for bigger campaigns. Moreover, Switzerland's infrastructure was designed for sabotage. Swiss engineers had turned their own country into a death trap. Bridges across the Rhine were packed with explosives. Railway tunnels, vital for moving supplies between Germany and Italy, were rigged to collapse. Even hydroelectric dams were prepared for demolition. If the Wehrmacht marched in, Switzerland could quite literally blow itself apart, denying Germany the very resources it sought. Operation Tannenbaum remained on Hitler's desk throughout 1940 and 1941, but it was never signed into action. Several factors shaped this decision. 1. The fall of France changed priorities. Once France surrendered in June 1940, Switzerland was no longer a strategic gap in Hitler's western defenses. The Reich now controlled everything from the Atlantic coast to the Alps. Switzerland, though centrally located, no longer blocked major German advances. It became a minor obstacle rather than a pressing target. 2. The Soviet Union beckoned. Even as German officers debated Switzerland, Hitler's eyes turned eastward. In December 1940, he issued Directive No. 21, the order for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It would be the largest military operation in history. Every division, every tank, every gallon of fuel was suddenly precious. In such a context, diverting 300,000 men to fight in the Alps seemed absurd. 3. The cost-benefit analysis favored neutrality. Unlike Poland or France, Switzerland offered little strategic reward. It had no oil, no vast food supply, no great industrial heartland. Its greatest value lay in its banking system and trade, services that were far more useful to Germany if Switzerland remained officially neutral. 4. The propaganda question. Hitler liked to portray himself as a master strategist, not a butcher of small neutral states. Invading Switzerland might have undermined his image internationally, even among potential collaborators. By contrast, leaving Switzerland alone while bullying it into economic concessions served both his propaganda and his war machine. German pressure on Switzerland did not always take the form of military threats. Often, it came through economic coercion. Berlin demanded that Swiss banks accept Nazi gold, much of it looted from occupied Europe and Jewish victims. Swiss industries were pressured to sell precision instruments and machine tools vital for the German war effort. But Hitler also recognized Switzerland's utility as a neutral intermediary. Both Axis and Allied powers used Swiss soil for espionage, prisoner exchanges, and secret diplomacy. Destroying that neutrality by invasion would close one of the few remaining windows to the outside world. Historians such as Stephen Holbrook have argued that this dual role, banker and buffer, was perhaps Switzerland's strongest shield. By being more valuable intact than conquered, the Swiss gave Hitler a reason to hesitate. And yet, fear played its part too. Hitler was not blind to the Swiss spirit of resistance. He loathed their democratic traditions, mocking Switzerland as a stain of democracy in the middle of his empire. In his private conversations, he often spoke of one day erasing Switzerland altogether. But loathing did not equal action. German generals reminded him repeatedly, to invade Switzerland would be to abandon the very principles of blitzkrieg. It would require grinding mountain warfare, enormous garrisons, and endless guerrilla skirmishes. Hitler could afford none of these when his gaze was fixed on Moscow. Different historians have emphasized different reasons for Hitler's restraint. Stephen Holbrook, target Switzerland. Switzerland survived because it was militarily prepared to make conquest ruinous. William Shirer, the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Hitler viewed Switzerland as militarily irrelevant once France had fallen and therefore expendable. German military records highlighted Switzerland's economic usefulness and the Wehrmacht's reluctance to sacrifice divisions for little gain. Modern scholars stressed the combination, deterrence, usefulness, and timing, rather than a single decisive factor. Together, these perspectives reinforce the idea that Hitler's decision was pragmatic, not sentimental. Switzerland was left standing because it was cheaper to leave standing. By the end of 1941, Operation Tannenbaum was quietly shelved. Hitler's gaze was locked firmly on the Soviet Union, his armies deep in the snows of Russia. Switzerland, for all its defiance, became a side note in the grander narrative of the war. But its survival was no accident. It was the product of Swiss determination, geography, and a dictator's cold arithmetic. For all his power, Hitler calculated that Switzerland was not worth the blood. Switzerland's survival in the Second World War is one of the great paradoxes of the Nazi era. Here was a small republic of just 4 million people, encircled by the greatest war machine Europe had ever seen, led by a dictator who seemed unstoppable. Yet Hitler never gave the order to invade. To understand why, we must dig beneath the surface. It was not a single reason, but a web of military, economic, diplomatic, and psychological factors that, together, convinced the Reich that Switzerland was a fight not worth having. At its core, war is a calculation of costs and benefits. For Hitler and his generals, the calculus of invading Switzerland was grim. The Swiss landscape was not simply defensible, it was designed to be a trap. The towering Alps formed an almost impenetrable wall, where armored divisions would be reduced to crawling columns on narrow roads. Swiss engineers had anticipated every possible route of invasion. Mountain passes were pre-mined, bridges wired with explosives, and tunnels prepared for demolition. One push of a button, and vital arteries would vanish in smoke and rubble. Every town and village was fortified. Church steeples doubled as observation posts. Farmhouses were rigged with machine gun nests. Entire valleys could be transformed into killing zones. The Swiss army, though small, was everywhere, embedded within the very geography of the land. The Swiss did not plan to hold the lowlands. Instead, they would retreat into the Alpine heartland, abandoning cities if necessary, but denying control of the high mountains. There, in a network of bunkers, fortresses, and caves, they would hold out indefinitely. German commanders estimated it would take hundreds of thousands of troops to root them out, far more than Hitler could spare. Blitzkrieg thrived on rapid encirclement. Switzerland offered none of that. What it promised was prolonged attrition, the very opposite of Germany's war doctrine. Military planners warned Hitler that an Alpine campaign would drain resources, slow the timetable for operations elsewhere, and bog the Wehrmacht down in endless guerrilla resistance. For a dictator obsessed with speed, shock, and decisive victories, Switzerland looked less like a target and more like a quagmire. While Switzerland's geography made it difficult to invade, its economy made it convenient to keep neutral. Swiss banks were the vaults of Europe. They provided secrecy, liquidity, and international access. For Nazi Germany, cut off from many global financial systems, Switzerland became indispensable. Gold stolen from occupied central banks, Jewish families, and forced laborers often flowed through Swiss accounts. This gold could then be exchanged for foreign currencies, enabling Germany to buy raw materials abroad despite Allied blockades. Had Hitler invaded, those banking services would vanish overnight. The Reich would seize vaults, yes, but the secrecy and international credibility of Swiss finance would collapse. By leaving Switzerland officially independent, Hitler could continue to exploit it economically. Switzerland was more than a banker. Its industries produced high-quality precision goods, watches, optics, tools, and machinery. These products were valuable for the German war effort. Neutral Switzerland could trade with Germany openly, while also dealing cautiously with the Allies. For Berlin, this was a win-win. Conquest would disrupt production. Neutrality preserved the flow. Hitler's regime often bullied Switzerland economically. Demands for gold transfers, pressured sales, and trade agreements allowed the Reich to extract value without deploying divisions. In effect, Switzerland was milked like a cow rather than slaughtered. Historians such as Stephen Holbrook, Target Switzerland, argue that this economic usefulness was one of the strongest deterrents against invasion. Switzerland was more profitable standing than occupied. Switzerland's neutrality was not just economic. It was political, and it had uses far beyond money. Both the Allies and Axis powers flooded Switzerland with spies. Bern, Zurich, and Geneva became centers of intelligence gathering, secret negotiations, and prisoner exchanges. Swiss neutrality allowed these covert networks to function. Germany benefited from this as much as anyone. Destroying Switzerland by invasion would close one of the last neutral spaces in Europe, eliminating a valuable arena for intelligence and diplomacy. Switzerland also served as a buffer between Axis powers. With German territory to the north and Italy to the south, Switzerland sat like a wedge in the middle. So long as it remained neutral, it stabilized relations between the two allies. If occupied, it might complicate logistics and even fuel rivalries over who controlled its territory. For Hitler, image mattered. He had already earned condemnation for destroying Poland, Norway, and the Low Countries. Invading Switzerland, a small, neutral democracy, might provoke backlash even among potential collaborators. By leaving Switzerland intact, Hitler could project a calculated restraint, preserving the fiction of respecting neutrality when useful. Switzerland may have been small, but it was not meek. Its very posture of defiance was a form of deterrence. The Swiss militia system meant nearly every adult male was a soldier. By 1940, the country could mobilize nearly 500,000 men, astonishing for a nation of its size. More importantly, those men were motivated. They were defending their homes, families, and valleys. German commanders warned Hitler that morale like this could not be easily broken. Swiss leaders broadcast their readiness constantly. Posters warned, "Every man a soldier. Every house a fortress." Military drills were public, designed to project determination. German intelligence took these signals seriously. Even if exaggerated, the perception of fierce resistance was enough to give pause. In private, Hitler mocked Switzerland as a pimple on the face of Europe and a stain of democracy. He dreamed of absorbing it into the Reich. Yet his actions betrayed hesitation. He knew the Swiss would fight, and he understood that conquering them would mean trading tanks and planes for dynamite and caves. Fear, in its coldest form, stayed in his hand. Timing is everything in war. And in the case of Switzerland, timing saved it. In December 1940, Hitler issued Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was not just another campaign. It was the ultimate gamble, a war of annihilation on an unprecedented scale. To succeed, Hitler needed every available division, every tank, every aircraft. Switzerland, in this context, was a distraction. Invading it would consume hundreds of thousands of troops that could instead be thrown into Russia. The Alpine campaign promised little but attrition, while the East promised the conquest of resources, land, and ideology. Once Barbarossa began in June 1941, Germany's war machine became a ravenous beast. Casualties soared, fuel was consumed at staggering rates, and reinforcements were always short. By 1942, Hitler no longer had the luxury of opening new fronts against neutral states. Every soldier was needed in the East. Ironically, when Germany was strongest in 1940, Switzerland was not yet a priority. By the time it might have become one, the Reich was already overextended. Switzerland slipped off the agenda, not because it ceased to matter, but because larger campaigns consumed everything. Some historians caution against overstating Switzerland's security. Operation Tannenbaum was drawn up in detail. Hitler could have launched it if he had chosen. Switzerland made concessions to the Reich, trading goods, accepting Nazi gold, restricting Allied flights, which may have been as much appeasement as deterrence. There were moments of real danger, after France fell, after Barbarossa stalled, and during Allied bombing campaigns. At each point, Switzerland feared that neutrality might not be enough. Yet in the end, no invasion came. Concessions and deterrence together helped maintain the fragile balance. Switzerland's survival was not luck, nor was it the result of a single factor. It was the product of a web of deterrence. A landscape designed for resistance. An army of citizens willing to fight. Economic services too valuable to lose. A role as a diplomatic buffer and espionage hub. And above all, the shifting priorities of a dictator obsessed with conquering eastward. Even Hitler, the conqueror of Europe, recognized when the costs outweighed the benefits. Switzerland was spared not because it was untouchable, but because, in the cold arithmetic of war, it was more useful alive than conquered. In the shadows of the Alps, Switzerland endured, not by accident, but by design. The story of Switzerland in the Second World War often carries an air of triumph, a tiny nation staring down Hitler's empire and surviving untouched. Yet reality, as history so often reminds us, is never that simple. Switzerland did survive, but not without moral compromises, dangerous incidents, and uneasy concessions that continue to spark debate today. The question is not simply why Hitler didn't invade, but also what Switzerland did, and didn't do, to prevent invasion. Operation Tannenbaum, the invasion that almost happened. Historians are unanimous that Germany considered invading Switzerland seriously. Plans were drawn, troop numbers calculated, maps studied. Operation Tannenbaum called for as many as 300,000 German and Italian troops to cross the borders simultaneously. The Wehrmacht's 12th Army under General Wilhelm List was designated for the northern attack. Italian divisions would push through Ticino in the south. The goal was to seize key Swiss cities, Zurich, Geneva, Bern, within days, while bottling up resistance in the Alps. Documents preserved in the Bundesarchiv, German Federal Archives, reveal that Hitler personally discussed the invasion in the summer of 1940, shortly after the fall of France. He mocked Swiss independence as ridiculous and declared that the Swiss are the most despicable people and deserve to be wiped out. So why wasn't the order given? Historians debate. Stephen Holbrook argues that Switzerland's preparedness, every bridge wired with explosives, every valley a fortress, convinced Hitler the cost would outweigh the gain. William Shirer, by contrast, insists that Switzerland's military significance was trivial once France fell, and that Hitler shelved Tannenbaum not out of fear but out of disinterest. Modern scholars like S.P. Mackenzie emphasized shifting priorities. Barbarossa, not Bern, determined Hitler's decisions. What these interpretations show is that Switzerland's fate was never secure. The invasion was one meeting, one directive, one mood swing away from reality. Switzerland's neutrality was not respected consistently. During the war, its skies and borders were violated repeatedly by both Axis and Allied forces. In 1940, German planes violated Swiss airspace more than 200 times in a matter of months. Swiss anti-aircraft units and fighter pilots responded aggressively, shooting down at least 11 Luftwaffe aircraft. This infuriated Berlin, which demanded reparations and threatened retaliation. The Allies were no gentler. In April 1944, American bombers mistakenly attacked the Swiss town of Schaffhausen, killing over 40 civilians. Washington later apologized, but the incident underscored how vulnerable Swiss neutrality was in practice. German troops occasionally crossed into Swiss territory during maneuvers. Switzerland returned the favor by interning both Allied and Axis soldiers who entered its borders. Internment camps were set up, where airmen and soldiers were detained for the duration of the war. Neutrality, in practice, was fragile. Switzerland defended it fiercely, but violations showed how easily it could have been broken. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Switzerland's wartime conduct was its financial dealings with Nazi Germany. The gold question. The Reichsbank laundered gold looted from occupied nations and Jewish victims through Swiss banks. Between 1939 and 1945, Switzerland received an estimated $440 million in gold from Germany, roughly $6 to $7 billion today. Much of it had been stolen directly from the central banks of countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, and from victims of the Holocaust. The Bergier Commission, established in the 1990s, concluded that Switzerland had been the banker of the Reich, enabling Germany to sustain its war economy despite Allied blockades. Trade with the Reich. Swiss factories also supplied machinery, ball bearings, and precision instruments vital for German weapons production. In return, Switzerland imported coal, food, and raw materials. The moral debate. Defenders argue Switzerland had no choice. Surrounded by Axis powers, it traded to survive. Critics counter that by doing so, Switzerland prolonged the Nazi war effort. Neutrality, they say, shaded into complicity. Switzerland's neutrality frustrated not only Germany but also the Allies. Britain and the United States were suspicious of Swiss financial dealings. Winston Churchill privately referred to Switzerland as Hitler's little bank. U.S. Treasury officials pressured Swiss banks to stop accepting Nazi gold. In 1943, the Allies even considered sanctioning or bombing Swiss industry to cut off supplies to the Reich. At the same time, the Allies used Switzerland themselves, for intelligence gathering, for negotiations with Axis defectors, for Red Cross activities. Neutrality was convenient when useful, infuriating when it benefited the enemy. Switzerland also faced a moral test with refugees. On the one hand, it provided sanctuary to tens of thousands fleeing war, soldiers, civilians, Jews, and political dissidents. The International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva, played a vital role in humanitarian relief. On the other hand, Swiss authorities often turned away Jewish refugees at the border, citing fears of overpopulation and Nazi retaliation. In 1938, Swiss officials notoriously pressured Germany to mark Jewish passports with a J so they could more easily identify and exclude them. The result was a mixed legacy. Switzerland saved lives, but also refused many who perished. Neutrality carried not only strategic compromises but human ones. Another counterargument to the idea of Swiss immunity is the role of the Allies themselves. Had Switzerland leaned too heavily toward Germany, Britain or the United States might have treated it as a collaborator. By maintaining a delicate balance, trading with Germany but also tolerating Allied intelligence networks, Switzerland avoided drawing Allied wrath. This suggests that Swiss survival was not just about deterring Hitler, but about not provoking the Allies either. Swiss propaganda emphasized total resistance, every citizen a soldier, every house a fortress. But some historians caution that this was partly illusion. The Swiss army, though well-trained, was lightly equipped compared to the Wehrmacht. It had few tanks, limited aircraft, and outdated artillery. Had Germany committed fully, Switzerland may not have held out indefinitely. Resistance would have been fierce, but likely crushed in time. The true deterrent, these historians argue, was not Swiss strength alone but the calculation that it was not worth the effort. Neutrality, in this sense, worked not because Switzerland was invincible, but because it was inconvenient. Another uncomfortable truth, Switzerland benefited from timing. In 1940, when Germany was strongest, it focused on France and Britain, not Switzerland. By 1941, Hitler's gaze had turned east. By 1943, the Reich was on the defensive. At no point did Germany enjoy both the capacity and the incentive to invade. Neutrality worked, but so did luck. After the war, Switzerland faced hard questions. The Bergier Commission concluded in 2002 that Switzerland had done more than neutrality demanded in accommodating Nazi Germany. Reparations were made to Holocaust survivors whose families' assets had been absorbed by Swiss banks. Yet defenders still insist that Switzerland did what it had to do to survive, and that its deterrent strategy saved it from occupation. The truth lies somewhere in between. Survival was achieved, but at a price. Switzerland's survival in World War II was remarkable, but not without shadows. Operation Tannenbaum shows how close invasion came. Border skirmishes and bombings revealed how fragile neutrality was. Financial dealings and refugee restrictions exposed moral compromises. The lesson is sobering. Small states may endure by walking a tightrope, but the balance is never clean. Switzerland lived in the gray zone between resistance and collaboration, between courage and compromise. In the end, the swastika never flew over Bern. But history reminds us that Switzerland's survival was not a fairy tale of defiance alone. It was a story of danger, diplomacy, and difficult choices. A war survived, but not without scars. By May 1945, Nazi Germany lay in ruins. Hitler was dead in his Berlin bunker. The Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. The Allies divided Europe into zones of occupation. And in the center of the continent, Switzerland still stood, unoccupied, unbroken, its borders intact. To many outsiders, this survival looked miraculous. While Poland had been obliterated, while France had been humiliated, while entire nations were erased from the map, Switzerland remained free. No German boots had marched through Bern, Zurich, or Geneva. No Nazi governor had been installed in its towns. No swastika ever replaced the white cross on its flag. But survival carried shadows. Switzerland had endured, yes. But not without compromise, not without controversy, and not without a reckoning that would echo long after the guns of war fell silent. The price of neutrality. The Swiss called it armed neutrality. Historians call it a balancing act. But the world after 1945 began to ask harder questions. What did neutrality mean in practice? Did it mean resisting all sides equally, or did it mean doing business with both sides as long as it guaranteed survival? Trade with the Reich. During the war, Switzerland sold goods to Germany, machine tools, ball bearings, electrical equipment. These were not luxuries but items that fed the Nazi war machine. Critics argued this prolonged the war. Nazi gold in Swiss vaults. The Bergier Commission's report decades later confirmed that Swiss banks accepted tons of Nazi gold. Some of it came directly from occupied central banks, some was looted from Jews before their murder in concentration camps. The secrecy of Swiss banking shielded these transactions, but when exposed, it left a permanent stain. Refugee restrictions. Tens of thousands of Jews and refugees found safety in Switzerland. But tens of thousands more were turned away. Border guards often sent desperate families back into occupied France or Austria, where deportation and death awaited. Neutrality, the Swiss government argued, required strict control of entry. History judged it differently. Neutrality had saved the state. But it had not saved everyone. The post-war reckoning. Switzerland emerged from the war physically unscathed, but morally entangled. Unlike its neighbors, its cities were not rubble, its railways not cratered, its people not displaced. Its economy, in fact, had grown stronger, benefiting from wartime trade and banking. But this prosperity came at a cost: suspicion. Allied pressure. The Allies were not blind to Switzerland's role. The US and Britain demanded accountability for gold transactions. They pressured Swiss banks to reveal accounts tied to Nazi assets. In 1946, under the Washington Agreement, Switzerland agreed to transfer $58 million in gold to the Allies, a fraction of what it had received, but a symbolic concession. The Bergier Commission. Decades later, in the 1990s, mounting evidence forced a deeper investigation. The Bergier Commission concluded that Switzerland had failed the test of humanity by rejecting many Jewish refugees and facilitating Nazi financial operations. The revelations led to global outrage, lawsuits, and ultimately, compensation agreements with Holocaust survivors and their families. A damaged reputation. For much of the Cold War, Switzerland maintained its neutrality with pride. But the revelations of the 1990s reshaped its image. No longer was it seen only as the plucky fortress that defied Hitler. It was also the banker that enabled him. The strategic lessons of Surviva. Despite these moral compromises, Switzerland's survival holds lessons for history and for today. Deterrence works. The Swiss strategy of the national redoubt demonstrated that even small states can deter great powers by making conquest too costly. The Wehrmacht could have invaded, but the price, in men, material, and time, outweighed the reward. Deterrence, when credible, is as powerful as armies. Neutrality as a tool. Switzerland showed that neutrality can be more than passivity. It can be weaponized, used to extract economic deals, to maintain independence, to serve as a meeting ground for enemies. In a polarized world, neutrality offered leverage. The power of geography. Mountains cannot be moved. The Alps were Switzerland's greatest ally, forcing any invader to play on Swiss terms. Geography shaped destiny, giving a small state the strength to hold off a continent's conqueror. The danger of moral gray zones. But Switzerland also showed the darker side of survival. Neutrality shielded the state, but it blurred morality. Deals were made with dictators. Refugees were turned away. Survival was bought with compromise. Comparisons with other neutral states. Switzerland was not the only neutral country in World War II. Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey also avoided direct invasion. Each survived by balancing concessions with deterrence. Sweden exported iron ore to Germany while quietly supplying the Allies with intelligence. Spain under Franco remained officially neutral but leaned toward the Axis early in the war. Portugal traded with both sides, granting Britain naval bases in the Azores while selling wolfram, tungsten, to Germany. Turkey held off entering the war until 1945, maintaining its independence through careful diplomacy. What made Switzerland unique was its geography, and its total encirclement. Unlike others, it had no coastline, no escape route, no allies nearby. Neutrality was not a choice of convenience, but of necessity. The Cold War and beyond. After 1945, the world quickly divided into East and West. Switzerland remained neutral again, but in a different context. It became a hub for diplomacy. Geneva hosted negotiations, peace talks, and international organizations. The Red Cross, headquartered in Switzerland, played a global role in humanitarian work. Its banks continued to thrive, though secrecy would eventually come under international pressure in the late 20th century. The memory of World War II, however, lingered. For Swiss citizens, it became a story of resilience, how their fathers and grandfathers stood ready with rifles in the mountains, how the country outlasted Hitler's rage. For critics, it became a story of compromise, how neutrality masked financial opportunism and moral failures. The symbolism of survival. For small nations today, Switzerland's survival remains a symbol. It proves that geography, deterrence, and diplomacy can protect even the most vulnerable. But it also serves as a warning: survival bought at any price can leave lasting scars. The Alps became a shield. The militia became a deterrent. The banks became both a tool and a curse. Neutrality, in the end, saved the Swiss state, but not its innocence. In the summer of 1940, as Nazi tanks rolled across Europe, few believed Switzerland would endure. Yet it did. No swastika ever flew over its capital. No German boots ever trampled its mountains. Its survival was a triumph of deterrence, geography, and timing. But survival was not pure. It came with compromises, some practical, others damning. Switzerland's story reminds us that in times of total war, neutrality is never clean. It is a balancing act between resistance and concession, morality and pragmatism. History remembers Switzerland as the country Hitler never invaded. But the full story is more complex. It is the story of a nation that survived by turning its mountains into fortresses, its economy into a bargaining chip, and its neutrality into both a shield and a shadow.